Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. We're just going to wait for a couple more of our attendees to join, and then we'll be getting started. Okay, it's now 9 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Just wanted to say good morning and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us on today's Emirates Green Building Council technical webinar on the topic of city resilience. I'd like to give a special welcome to all our Emirates Green Building Council members and partners who will already be familiar with our activities and monthly workshops. So today is the first online edition of our technical workshops, which we have moved online due to the current global health situation and COVID-19 pandemic. With health and safety being of the most important priority to Emirates Green Building Council, we are moving a number of our events and trainings online over the next couple of months. So before we start, I would just like to give a brief introduction to Emirates Green Building Council to some of you who might not be so familiar, or it might be the first Emirates Green Building Council event you've attended. So Emirates Green Building Council are a not-for-profit membership organisation that was formed in 2006 to contribute to the UAE's goal to be a global leader in sustainability in the built environment. The Council brings together organisations which share our mission and serves as a platform for collaboration and knowledge sharing. We run an educational programme with events and trainings throughout the year aimed at raising awareness of green building practice and providing the knowledge and skills to build capacity in the UAE. So an important platform in the programme is our monthly technical workshops, which are dedicated to sharing knowledge in the green building industry. The workshops are facilitated by our expert Emirates Green Building Council members and are designed to address the challenges, share solutions and best practice on various topics relevant to the building industry in the UAE. They're completely educational and don't include sales or marketing content, and we aim to keep the platform for discussion and networking also. So the technical workshops are generally open only for Emirates Green Building Council members and partners. However, for today, we've opened the webinar to all due to the importance and relevance of the topic, especially in the current global situation. So if you wish to receive any information about the technical workshops, you want to find out how you can facilitate one or share feedback on topics that would be of interest, then we encourage you to contact us on the email address which is on the screen now. So before I introduce today's facilitator and topic, there's just a few practical points that I would like to cover. So we aim to keep the technical webinar as interactive as possible on this platform. So throughout the webinar, you can submit your questions using the questions box on your control panel. Your microphone will stay muted, but you can type in the questions. The EmiratesGBC team will be monitoring the questions. I have Janan and Maj on the webinar also. And we'll try and answer any logistical questions directly, and all the other questions we will direct to our facilitator during the Q&A session after the presentation. So throughout the webinar, we will have a few polling questions for you to complete and share your opinions. So to start off, I would like to find out how many Emirates Green Building Council members and partners we have on the call today. So if you could just quickly complete the survey, give you a few moments. Okay, closing the poll, and then we can share the results. Okay, great. So we definitely have some people who are already familiar with Emirates Green Building Council, but we have quite a lot of non-members on the call today. So if any of you are interested in finding out how you can become a member, then definitely do reach out to us on the email address which I provided previously. Continuing with the presentation. So also just to let you know that we will, after the webinar, we will share with you a recording of the presentation. We'd also ask you to share your feedback by completing the survey when you exit the webinar, and also join the conversation on social media by following Emirates Green Building Council's handles on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and tagging us and using the hashtags EGBC webinars and Let's Get Technical to share your. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's topic and facilitator. So Huda is an Associate Director of the Built Environment Consultancy ARUP and has over 12 years experience of sustainable development projects in the region, working on high-profile projects such as Expo 2020 and the Abu Dhabi Plan Capital 2030. Huda has been an active member of Emirates Green Building Council for a while now and currently serves on the Management Committee as Secretary of the Emirates Green Building Council Board of Directors. So we are absolutely delighted to have Huda with us today to provide an overview of city resilience and be the first presenter for one of our online webinars. So I'm just going to hand over to Huda now to give the presentation.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here and thank you for joining us, sharing your valuable time. It's interesting that I talked to Jason and others at the Emirates Green Building Council about doing this workshop a couple of months ago before the pandemic was announced. And I don't think at the time we thought it would be a webinar, but it's probably even more relevant now. So I'll try to keep it short so that we can do a discussion during the Q&A if possible. And please, if I'm going too fast or speaking too quickly, let the organizers know and they'll tell me to slow down. So as Lindsay mentioned, I work for ARUP, we're a global consultancy firm. I think at the very beginning, if we could just do a quick poll just to see how do people feel about city resilience, how familiar people are with the topic, that would be helpful to me actually as well. Okay, okay, good. So we have almost an even mix. So a lot of the presentation today will be at the kind of introductory intermediate level. Pretty much all of the content is available online, so don't worry about kind of scribbling away, and the recording will be made available. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts afterwards, specifically around what this all means for us today, but also in the long term. So if we begin with the topic. So what is city resilience? Very briefly, it's the capacity of cities, and by cities, I mean the individuals in the cities, the communities, the institutions, the businesses, and the systems, whether that's infrastructure or natural environment, the capacity of these, all of these, to survive, adapt, and thrive, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. So there's a few things to unpack in this definition. First of all, we're talking about complexity. So cities, especially cities in the time we're living in, come with complexity. They are a complex web of complex systems. So whether that's buildings, natural environment, infrastructure, transport, and so each system within itself is complex, but then also there's complexity in overlaying them all together. So this is the context in which we work in and why resilience is really important when we talk about cities today. So complexity is the first keyword. The second keyword is disruption. And it, again, in the complex world of today, we have a number of different types of disruptions. And I'll talk about two categories, both of which are really relevant. So there are shocks and stresses. So shocks are the kind that is happens quickly. So like an earthquake, a terrorism attack, for example, God forbid. So these are shocks instantaneous that happen at once, no warning. But there are also another kind of disruption that cities face, which are stresses. So stresses are chronic, longer-term challenges like poverty, for example, unemployment, water shortages. And they can be environmental, they can be related to the society, to the infrastructure. So sometimes we get distracted by thinking and worrying about the shocks that we also forget that the city has to respond to stresses. And a resilient city can respond to both the shocks and the stresses. And that's what we're talking about today, the ability of a city to respond to both shocks and stresses. So there's lots of terms being thrown around. How does resilience relate to things like climate change adaptation or mitigation, or disaster reduction, or one of our favorite, of course, sustainable development and sustainability? And I think it goes back to what we talked about just now in terms of what we mean by resilience and city resilience. To me, what's really, so if I look at the last two specifically, sustainability and resilience, they are complementary. They're not equal to each other, as in they don't mean the same thing, and they're not substitutes for each other. So we can't plan for sustainability and assume resilience will be taken care of, or vice versa. They are complementary in the sense that I think there are two important lenses that we need to look at for a city. Sustainability is a lot of times around the steady state solution. So how do we get to a balance? How do we get to that equilibrium? Resilience actually is almost the opposite, and it talks about what do we do when we don't have that balance? What do we do on the journey to that balance when there are disruptions? How do we react and adapt to those disruptions? Sustainability generally looks at overall, on the average, overall consumption, overall performance. Resilience actually has a specific focus on everybody, but especially the most vulnerable. And so it's about taking care of everybody, not just the average, not just the overall. And so you'll see, for example, the SDG Goal 11 is about inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities. So they are complementary agendas, but not one and the same. And I'd be happy to take questions about this later on, because it's a concept I struggled with for a little bit. But once you kind of can get your head from one paradigm to another, it becomes really, really useful, two very useful frameworks to use. So about 8 to 9 years ago, ARUP were given an opportunity to articulate what does urban resilience mean. So what is urban resilience, and how can we articulate it in an accessible, evidence-based, and measurable way? So the specific challenge around this was how do we make the concept of resilience tangible, practical, and relevant to decision makers, to all the various city actors, whether they're citizens or communities or government organizations. How do we talk about city resilience in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that's evidence-based and that's real and practical and tangible? I'm not talking kind of academic talk here. We're talking about what does this actually mean for people. And ARUP's response was to do a lot of research, look at evidence from cities around the world, how they have managed and adapted to shocks and stresses and what worked for them. And that's through literature review, through interviews with the cities, through working with pilot cities, and looking at standards and the various forms of existing frameworks and assessments. And so this is just to give you a snapshot of some of the cities that we worked with, and whether they were case studies or pilot cities, etc. This work carried over a few years. And the outcome of all of this is this conceptual framework, the City Resilience Index, which I'll talk more about for the rest of the session today. So the way to think about this, if you look at the black circle in the middle, there are 4 different dimensions: health and well-being, economy and society, nature, infrastructure and ecosystems, leadership and strategy. And we'll talk about each of these in a bit more detail in a second. Each dimension has 3 goals related to it. So 4 dimensions, 12 goals to what we mean by city resilience. And the 7 words in the middle that go diagonally, those are qualities. If we want to describe resilient cities, those are qualities that, if we want to describe a resilient city, those are qualities that we can use. So flexible, as in the city and its actors, its systems, its citizens, its governance, willing and able to adopt alternative strategies. Redundant, so it purposely incorporates spare capacity. Resilient city is robust. It's well-conceived and managed systems. A resilient city is resourceful. It's able to recognize alternative ways of doing things. A resilient city is reflective. It's able to learn from past experiences and look at what that means for the future. A resilient city is inclusive. There's shared sense of ownership and decision-making across the city. And a resilient city is integrated. There's a coordinated effort and work across the various institutions in the city. So those 7 qualities describe the city, but also various parts of the goals and the dimensions. And this was the framework released in 2014, 6 years ago. And we've been using this to work with cities ever since. So if we take a bit of a deep dive into this, so we talked about the 4 dimensions and the 12 goals. We'll talk more about them in the next slides. I also wanted to mention that there are a set of indicators. So there are 52 indicators to go with the goals that go into more specific detail about what, how do we achieve this goal? How do we know where are we in terms of achieving this goal? And then actually behind the 52 indicators, there are 156 questions, a mix of qualitative and quantitative, that can help anybody trying to assess a city's resilience figure out where are the strengths, the weaknesses, where does the city sit in terms of this resilience framework. You'll be glad to know that we're not going through the 52 indicators or the 156 questions. I'll spare you that today, but those are all available online. So you can look through those if you wish. But we'll try and take a look a bit more at the 4 dimensions. So the first dimension is the people dimension, health and well-being. And by that, we're not just talking about physical health. So that the 3 goals under this dimension are minimal human vulnerability, which talks about providing the basic food, healthcare, shelter for everybody in the city. There's also a goal around diverse livelihood and employment. So that's about giving everybody in the city access to training, to support services, to financial services, to enable them to have employment opportunities, etc. And then there's a 3rd goal around provision of health services, and that's whether it's physical or mental health, public health education, sanitation, so things that revolve around the health sector. And again, we're talking about providing it in an accessible, affordable way to everybody. So this is the people dimension of the framework. The next dimension looks at economy and society. So in terms of organizations that function within a city. So one which I think is really important is the 4th goal around collective identity and mutual support. And actually, a lot of our case studies have shown that cities that have a strong collective identity and strong community cohesion do a lot better in times of shocks specifically. There is also a goal around comprehensive rule of law, and how does that stand, not just when the city is functioning normally, but in the case of emergencies and disruptions. There is also a goal around sustainable economy. How diverse is the economy? How diverse are the business opportunities? And also how, in terms of private businesses, do they have business continuity plans? Is the private sector ready to react to a disruption, whether it's a shock or a stress? Moving on to the third dimension, and this looks at place. So both physical, hard infrastructure, and as well as the natural environment. So looking at them together, what is the physical exposure of our infrastructure system? So have we conserved our environmental assets so that they can protect us when we need them to? Do the infrastructure and natural environment systems work together? Seismicity and building codes relating to earthquakes, for example, come under that. The eighth goal is around continuity of services and infrastructure systems. So does the city have well-maintained systems? Are they being actively managed? It's not just about building a good system, but also maintaining and managing it. Is there the long-term flexibility and robustness that's required in those systems? The ninth goal is around transport and digital infrastructure. And I think we're acutely aware of how those are important today. Is there a multimodal flexible transport system? What does the ICT network look like? Technology, what does the freight network look like? What does the logistics network look like? Can we get food and other basic requirements to people where they need them? Can people get to where they need to get to safely, even in the time of disruption? Finally, the last dimension is around knowledge. The leadership and strategy looks at one, effective leadership in terms of collaboration across some of the agencies, multi-stakeholder engagement around decision-making, strong local governance. There's also a goal around empowered stakeholders, whether that's at an individual level or a community level. Do people know what they need to do? Do they know where to get help from? Do they know where to get information from? Are they educated around these topics? And do they have the knowledge they need? And finally, the last goal is around integrated development planning. Probably from built environment perspective, we're familiar with this, around having integrated land use plans, evidence-based, around having a strong and clear vision for the urban planning and land use planning of the city. So that's a really quick run through the 12 goals and how they sit in the framework. So to give me a break, it's a poll question for attendees. If you could please answer this question, that would be great. How important should resilience be to cities in the Gulf region, the GCC? How important do you think it should be in terms of the policy agendas and how much effort is put into them? Okay, wow, okay. Everybody feels they're really important. Good. We'll hopefully come back to this in the Q&A. So I mentioned the City Resilience Index, the CRI, which is the framework I just talked about. And the Rockefeller Foundation used that to launch a challenge to get cities around the world to develop resilience strategies using that framework. I'm not aware of cities in the Gulf region that have published resilience strategies, although I know a few of them are looking into city resilience. But I thought I'd share with you some examples from a couple of cities that we worked on in terms of developing the resilience strategy around the resilience framework. And what does that mean? What does that look like? So by the way, again, this is all the information that's available publicly. If you go to the 100 Resilient Cities website, the city strategies are published there. The challenges has actually ended in kind of mid-2019, but the website is still up and running and the strategies are still public. So one of the cities we worked on early on was Amman, the capital of Jordan. And we were the strategy partners for the Greater Amman municipality when developing the strategy. And Amman is an interesting city. It's the biggest city in terms of population in the Levant, around 4 million people. The strategy starts by setting out the assessment of what are the most relevant shocks and stresses that Amman faces or could face. So examples of shocks are economic crisis, terrorism, infrastructure failure, droughts, heat waves, flash floods. But they acknowledge the stresses as well, the long-term challenges. So whether that's water shortage, changing demographics with lots of migration into the city, lack of affordable housing, traffic congestion, limited access to finance and financial assistance. The strategy also looks at what are the city assets in terms of physical assets, in terms of economic assets, in terms of environmental assets, historical, etc. As I said, Amman is a large city population-wise, but it's also expected to grow even more. And this is about acknowledging the opportunities and the challenges and being proactive and upfront about building resilience to them. So there are climate-related risks, just like there are in most other places in the world. There are challenges around the recent influx of migrants, but also opportunities. Lack of natural resources, whether it's water or energy, are all examples of the things that Amman faces, and they've included in the strategy. They've acknowledged them, and the strategy is to address those challenges. So what the Amman strategy did is that the city, through many workshops and a broad engagement with multiple stakeholders, they defined 5 pillars for their resilience strategy around being an integrated and smart city, an environmentally proactive city, an innovative and prosperous city, a young and equal city, and a united and proud city. And then each of those pillars had a number of goals related to them, and each of the goals then had a number of actions. And each action is assigned a time frame, an owner, a budget. And the strategy captures all of this. So there's almost a page on each of the actions. And this was published a few years ago now. So it's one of the first strategies that was made public. And actually, I couldn't put the whole diagram in, but this diagram is from the strategy. And what they've done is they've mapped each of the actions to the relevant SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see a link between how do these actions meet the resilience opportunities and challenges, but also how do they help the city meet the SDGs. The second example I'll share is from a more recent strategy. It's actually, as far as I'm aware, the latest resilience strategy that was released, which is London's resilience strategy, just a few weeks ago. Again, same framework, same topics. The strategy starts by articulating a very clear vision for what London wants to be in 2050 in terms of resilience. And it looks at resilient citizens, but also the city being able to adapt and be agile, all these buzzwords, to the social and economic vulnerabilities, to the changes, to the disruptions, and being able to continually be prepared and face the disruptions that come. And so this is a really important point about what we're trying to do. It's not about doing something once and that's it, we're ready. It really is a continuous process of being prepared and building the resilience to whatever comes. So London also identified the major shocks and stresses, and you'll see some similar shocks and stresses to Amman and to other cities. So in terms of shocks, drought, extreme weather, pandemic was identified as a shock. Infrastructure failure, flooding, terrorist attack, cyber attack. In terms of stresses, so the long-term challenges, there are again commonalities like lack of social cohesion or aging infrastructure. There are some very specific things to London, like Brexit, which is going to be an ongoing process for the coming years. So they have very clearly identified the shocks and stresses, and this is not meant to be exhaustive because there could be lots more. This is about the major shocks and the major stresses that London is preparing itself for. The idea is that building a city resilience actually helps you address whichever shock or stress comes to you. So the way London developed their strategy is they identified 3 areas of opportunity. One around resilience of people, a second around resilience of place, and a third around resilience for processes. And then each of these opportunity areas has actions related to it. So there are 3 opportunity areas, and then 21 actions in total. Again, the strategy sets out each action in detail. So this is an example of one of the actions around the first opportunity around people. And they're looking at, believe it or not, London is looking at extreme heat management, as we saw last summer and a few summers before as well. So they've identified, for this action, what are the relevant shocks and stresses, and what are the relevant resilience values that addressing this action will bring. Who are the partners? Who are the people that will take the action? What is the timeline? Where will the funding come from? And each of the 21 actions has a page like this in the strategy that goes to that level of detail. Okay. So the final poll, I promise this is the last one. Now that you have an idea of what a resilience strategy could look like, how relevant do you feel resilience strategy is, or city resilience is, as a topic to the work you personally, individually do as a professional? Is it very relevant, somewhat relevant, hardly relevant?
Sorry, just having a slight technical difficulty on this poll. Give me one moment.
If you'd like, Lindsay, we can skip it and come back.
Yeah, I think if we could skip this one and then come back to it, that would be the best.
Yeah, not a problem. Okay, so hold your thought. We'll come back to that one. So really, the last bit of my presentation. Hopefully, it moves ahead.
Okay, that should work now.
Okay, perfect. So really, it's about how can we make a difference as professionals, as built environment professionals, as designers, as engineers, as policymakers, planners, government agencies, private sector, academics. How can we make a difference? How is this framework or this concept relevant to what we do and what we can do for our cities? And I'll just share a few thoughts on that. I feel like this framework was developed really to help make better investment decisions and to help have better urban planning, and focus on what matters And how do we know what matters? We know what matters based on the evidence that we've collected and we can collect from the cities around us. So that's what it's meant to do. I'll get to COVID-19 in a second. Really, the biggest change I hope to see in this area is kind of moving towards a paradigm where city resilience or urban resilience or resilience is not a kind of reactive post-disaster recovery topic. It is something that is kind of systematically looked at with a long-term approach, looking at multiple hazards and how do we deal with them. So I'm sure there'll be questions about COVID-19, so I thought I'd just put something up very quickly, just to share some initial thoughts, and it's early days really. But what does the pandemic we're going through now tell us about city resilience? And I'll start with a bit of a warning. I hope that we don't. Obviously, we have a big shock at our hands at a global level, and we have to react to it and try and get out of it as best we can and manage it for the next few months or years, who knows. What I hope doesn't happen is that we kind of narrow-mindedly focus on COVID-19 and build a very resilient city to that, and then kind of when the next shock or stress hits, and I can tell you it probably won't be another pandemic, it probably be something else, when we're back to kind of square one. So I'm hoping does happen as we look at the resilience more holistically, even from today. But in terms of COVID-19 specifically, I think, as I said, it's too early to tell really, and there'll be all sorts of discussions happening, whether it's international travel or logistics, food security, all the big decisions to happen and to come in. From a built environment perspective, I'd like to give kind of a couple of comments from a built environment perspective and from a behavioral change or people choice. So in terms of the built environment, I feel like this pandemic has shown us the value of having flexible streets and multimodal systems where street you can easily allow for more walking or more cycling spaces when people can't use the public transport system or when they it's not safe to come out and drive. So that flexibility and that multimodal aspect is really important. I'd like to think that it will help us really value our public spaces more and plan them in a way that they're more accessible. There's to everybody, they can be easily reached, they perform a function beyond just a beautification. I think there will be questions around retail spaces and how do what's going to happen with the big shopping malls, with online purchases, with people wanting to be physically distant from each other. What's going to happen to the big retail in terms of shops and entertainment venues, etc. And there's also obviously the digital infrastructure, and we knew it was important, but now we really, really depend on it. In terms of people choices, I expect people will start thinking differently perhaps about their housing choices in terms of where the house is located, what does that give them access to in terms of facilities, but also community. How big is their house? What amenities are within the house itself? There will be choices, I think, made differently around work and whether we commute to work or not, and what type of work and how much time we spend at work, and where we work, whether it's, what does the office look like if we do have an office. And then also around choices around how we spend our leisure time. So more family time or more time remotely versus being together or not, who knows. I feel like people will have different things to think about when making those choices. So that's all I'd say, but hopefully there'll be questions around this topic as well as the wider resilience. These are some links to where you can find the material I shared. So the City Resilience Index with all the dimensions and the goals and the indicators and the 156 questions if you wish to read through them. That's all on the CRI or the City Resilience Index website. The 100 Resilient Cities website has the city strategies from I think it's close to 97 cities. And Resilience Shift focuses specifically on resilience when it comes to infrastructure. They have some interesting thought pieces out there now. It's another available resource to look at. So I'll stop here and hopefully we can have some questions and answers.
Okay, thank you very much, Huda, for that really interesting presentation. We've had a couple of questions from the audience whilst you were presenting. So I will just take these in turn. So the first question that we were asked was, is there any plan or data for cities here in the Middle East?
Plan or data for cities in the Middle East?
Yes.
So as I mentioned, in terms of the Gulf, I'm not aware of a resilience strategy that has been published. In terms of the wider Middle East, there are resilience strategies for Amman, Ramallah, Byblos, Luxor. There may be one or two more. The data is always a tricky question in terms of the availability of the data, access to the data, the amount of data that's available as a city level or a country level, etc., etc. Which is why when we developed the City Resilience Index and looked at the indicators and the questions, there are quantitative indicators there, but there are also qualitative because we recognize that the data might not be there. So I think data is important, but in the absence of it, we have to try and still be able to give a qualitative assessment.
Okay, great, great. And then the next question that we had was relating to the City Resilience Index. The question is why choose to create the City Resilience Index rather than using some of the existing models such as RELI or the 100 Resilient Cities?
RELI? I'm not
Yeah.
familiar with RELI, but the City Resilience Index is what the 100 Resilient Cities was based on. So before the index was created, there was really no framework that interpreted what resilience means for a city. So the CRI came up, was published in 2014. It was probably 2 or 3 years in the making before then. And the CRI is what the 100 Resilient Cities then used over the last 5 years to develop their strategies. So it's as far as we were basically tasked to do this by the Rockefeller Foundation. They funded us to develop this framework because they couldn't find an available framework that does what they wanted to do.
Okay. Question. So the next question relates to ancient cities. They're asking, what are the possibilities and difficulties encountered when implementing city resilience in ancient cities around the world, with relevance to the infrastructure and also to the dimensions of economy and society in place?
Ooh, okay, that's a really interesting question. And I don't even know how you define ancient cities. And I guess most of my experience is in relatively new cities, mostly in the Gulf. But there are definitely some more challenges. I mean, even if you look at cities like Amman or London, let's say, which is, I don't know if London would qualify as ancient, but the public transport system has been there for over 100 years. So there are some inherent limitations. But also, at the same time, the cities that have developed over centuries have faced shocks and stresses before, and you will find they have almost developed in a way to allow them to adapt to those shocks and stresses more naturally, more organically. So I don't have an answer, I'm afraid, but I feel like there could be some really interesting lessons to be learned from the cities that have been planned and grew over centuries.
Definitely some interesting work looking at how the evolution of cities contributes to their resilience. The next couple of questions that we had were really related to the slides which you showed on the COVID-19. And one question that we have here is, are we observing that cities that were determined as resilient last year are withstanding the pandemic better today? So are those countries which were rated as higher in terms of resilience? Have we seen any kind of that they were able to cope better with the pandemic?
So that's the one of the million-dollar questions, right?
Yeah.
I don't know the answers. I don't know the answer to that. It's worth mentioning that the City Resilience Index is not a ranking. So there isn't kind of a number one city, a number two city, or where are we? It's a framework to help cities assess themselves. So there isn't a ranking, and there isn't the most resilient and the least resilient as far as the CRI is concerned. But yes, I think the really interesting question will be how have the resilience strategies helped cities become more resilient? Well, first of all, have they helped them? Yes or no? If yes, how? And what can cities around the world learn from that? Because a lot of the research that went into CRI was looking at past shocks and stresses, but I don't think there has been a pandemic in the past few decades, so it was probably that wasn't a case study that was available really. So it would be really interesting to see how the strategies helped or did not help the city. I think it's still an open question.
Yeah. Okay. And the other end of the question is quite similar in terms of the impact of pandemics. It's saying is several cities have long-term goals to achieve by 2030 and 2050. Do they need to revise the timeline, and how feasible are these goals?
Yeah, so I mean, just like almost any planning exercise, there are 2030 and 2050 goals, but if you look at the actions and the strategies, a lot of them are short and medium-term actions. So it's not like the cities that have developed the strategies are kind of taking easy and waiting till they get to 2030 or 2050. There is urgent action required, and the first part to me of an urgent action is having a long-term plan so that your urgent actions fit into that plan and don't go against it. So that's the idea. It's having a long-term plan and then having the short, medium, and long-term actions and strategies to go with that.
Okay, that makes sense. And we've got another question here which kind of follows on from that, which is, given the current situation, have you seen increased inquiries from government entities regarding resilient cities?
I'd like to say, well, kind of yes. Let's put it that way. I'm hoping that there will be maybe a renewed interest and understanding of the concept and its importance. It's probably early days. I think maybe if you ask me that question in a few months' time, I might have a more certain answer.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. We're still in the middle of it. So we've got a question here, which is in terms of implementation of resilience strategies. Can you give some context of examples of how you've seen resilience plans implemented effectively?
So I haven't been personally engaged in the resilient strategies development or the implementation. And a lot of these strategies are very new, but I mean, the question is spot on in terms of it's great having a strategy, but what about implementation? And I think that's a really important point, which remains to be seen, right? Because the past, so that if you look at the past decade, first few years was about what does resilience even mean for a city? And then there's a kind of a 5-year period of, okay, now that we understand what resilience means, here's our response to it in terms of a strategy and a policy. And I think only in the past couple of years have the actions really been starting on the ground. I think the 100 Resilient Cities website talks about a lot of the cities implementing, or at least starting to implement a lot of their actions. I can, it is, and it also says implementation is hard. That's the first statement under implementation. So there are challenges around, the interdependencies between government organizations, for example, or between communities, or and it's a new concept for people to get their heads around. Actually, to help with the implementation, what the Rockefeller Foundation funded is a position of a chief resilience officer, who's a kind of a senior government official. She or he would help with the development of the strategy, but also the implementation to help with the integration, help get all the entities coordinated. So again, I think it's one of those questions where it's really important, and time will tell, and we need a bit more time and more research to see what has happened on the ground in terms of actions.
Yeah, certainly more work to be done. There's another couple of questions which touch on the same thing, which is kind of relating to your previous answer. Is they're talking about how organisations can use some of the strategies and methods that they're already using and build upon them to have a resilient city strategy. So, for example, somebody mentioned the UAE EAD published climate change strategy, which has quite a lot of good data. But it's not a complete strategy. So do you feel that organisations can maybe take some of the work that they've already done on specific areas and kind of develop on that for a more complete resilience strategy?
Absolutely, yes. And so, I mean, London is a good example because as a city, they have existing strategies on all sorts of things. And so it's not about starting from scratch. It's about mapping out the shocks and stresses. And for some of these, there will be good strategies in place with action plans, etc. Great. And I think that's a fantastic starting point. And the EAD example is a good one. And it's looking at holistically and saying, okay, here we have an existing strategy here. What can we pull from that? And then where are the gaps and where do we need to develop more policies and strategies and actions? And then pulling that together so that the efforts actually kind of work with each other. And you can maybe have one action that addresses multiple areas.
Okay. And then one other kind of question, I think we've got some time for some more, is that asking how resiliency can impact greenhouse gases emissions of city. And kind of a sub question in that as well is that somebody's asking how we can see the current situation of COVID-19 impacting on building energy efficiency. Again, that's probably one which we're kind of in the middle of it to answer. But do you have any thoughts on how resilience will impact kind of building efficiency and global greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, thank you for the question. It kind of goes back to the heart of the, as sustainability and resilience are the same concept, the two sides of the same coin. And I think there are lots of synergies and there are trade-offs. So for example, if you're looking purely from a sustainable development, sustainability point of view, and let's be more specific, minimizing greenhouse gases or climate change mitigation perspective, it would be about, how do we minimize the tons of carbon per kilometer traveled? And it might actually lead to really focusing almost entirely on public transport or public transport and active transport. Whereas if you look at from a resilience angle, yes, that's important. And resilience is probably looking more at the adaptation side, climate change adaptation, but it's also looking at how do we make sure we have enough options, enough flexibility, enough robustness and redundancy in our system. So let's take the transport infrastructure as an example. How do we make sure there's enough redundancy and flexibility in that to allow us to bounce back from whatever shock or stress faces us? So in that sense, yes, it might be ideal to have 100% active transport, zero carbon emissions, but actually you need to plan the city in a way that allows you to have active transport, public transport, and also vehicles coming through for when you need to have them. And COVID-19 is a really interesting case where all of a sudden public transport is not an option because of the physical distancing, and so people may need to use their cars more or may need to have more walking and cycling. And so resilience sometimes kind of requires us to have options which may be suboptimal in terms of a carbon perspective, but are important for the day-to-day functioning of a city in such a complex world. To comment on the energy efficiency, again, so some of cities have identified energy, the scarceness of energy resources as a potential shock or a stress, and they're looking at so energy efficiency becomes an obvious action in terms of reducing our reliance on the energy resources. But interestingly, I was reading an article this morning about energy demand in New York going down by 20% during the pandemic at peak times, because basically there were people are not going to the offices. The lifts and the lighting in office buildings is a lot less. So there's a dip in the demand. So yes, I think we will have to wait and see what are the impacts. I think I'll just emphasize that sustainable development, or sustainability and resilience are complementary agendas. There are lots of synergies and there are some trade-offs, and they're both are important really, because we are planning for the real world.
You know, it's very, very interesting topic, and especially relevant at the moment, given the current situation. If you mentioned, as you mentioned through a lot of your answers, it's very early days, but there's definitely some learning to be taken forward in the future. So I think that's probably all the time for the questions that we have. I've managed to address the majority of them, but I will share the questions with Huda and the team afterwards, in case any of you feel your questions haven't been answered. Then I definitely encourage you to get in touch. So basically, the final word is just to say thank you once again for Huda for providing the overview on this topic and for starting the conversation. I think this is a topic that's just going to be coming up again and again through events and discussions in the UAE. So thank you everybody for also taking the time to attend this morning. I hope you found the presentation relevant. I would please encourage you to take the time to complete the feedback survey when you exit. We are always trying to make improvements and keep our events relevant, so your feedback is very greatly received. If you do have any further questions or need any more information, then please do contact us at the Technical Workshops email address, and please remember to follow us on social media. We have a number of different webinars which will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, other technical workshops, and also some events on advancing net zero and air quality. So please keep an eye on our social media and our mailing list to make sure that you receive all of those information. So thank you again for all attending. Please stay safe and healthy, and hope to see you at a future event. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.